What's up guys, Asian here again with another PTS theory crafting video for Elsweyr, and today we're going to be taking a look at the stamina DK, specifically what spammable is stamDK going to be using now. So the question arose once we read the PTS patch notes about the stamDK spammable. So right now stamDKs are mainly using Venomous claws or Rending slashes as their main spammable, mainly because currently on live, the way it works with Rending Slashes or Venomous Claws is you have the initial tick, and then about 1 second afterward, or about half a second afterward, you get the second tick, which is actually the first tick of the dot component behind both Rending Slashes and Venomous Claws. In Elsweyr, ZOS has decided to sort of standardize, so to speak, exactly how dots work. So now there's actually an extended delay between that initial hit and then the first dot tick. So as a result of this, Venomous Claws and Rending Slashes are no longer really viable as a spammable because you're no longer able to get those two hits to happen, every second or so. So naturally the next question is, well, what is going to be the next stamDK spammable? So three potential options arose kind of in discussions with TR and Toxic Rating Environment, the Discord server there. So one of the first things that Lyco, I believe, was the first one to actually point this out, was the fact that Venomous claws might not be the spammable, but instead we have Noxious Breath that got a little bit of a buff here with its initial hit. So the initial hit was buffed by, I believe it was about 150%. Might be a little bit more than that. So right now on the Elsweyr PTS, you can see here, I have it up on the screen right now. This is not exactly the build that I would be using to use Noxious Breath as a spammable, but the initial hit does 7k poison damage. So if I had to go over and swap into what I would normally be wearing, if I was going to be using this as a spammable, put everything together real quick. So if I were to be using it as a spammable, you can see here that it's dealing about 7.2k on the initial hit. So you'd be just using this as a spammable the whole time. And so if you're able to use this as a spammable, this also means that we were able to use the new Moulton Whip change. So the new Moulton Whip on the Elsweyr PTS, while you have it slotted, whenever you activate an Ardent Flame ability that is not Moulton Whip, you gain a stack of Seething Fury, which increases the damage of your next Moulton Whip by 33%, and your weapon and spell damage of 125 for 5 seconds. This effect can occur and stack up to 3 times. So by using Noxious Breath as your main spammable, you are able to basically maintain an additional 375 weapon damage. This is the base damage, so this is going to be affected by all of your weapon damage modifiers, which ends up making it very, very powerful. So naturally what you would be doing then is you would have Moulton Whip slotted here, and you would just be using Noxious Breath as your main spammable here. Then on the back bar here, you would also want to slot Moulton Whip, because you will also be trying to use Flames of Oblivion to maintain the Moulton Whip, the Seething Fury uptime here. So your bars would look something like this if you were going to be using Noxious Breath as a spammable. You will not obviously be using Moulton Whip. This is just here so that way you get the additional weapon damage from the Seething Fury stacks. Now, because it lasts for 5 seconds, it's going to be very similar to Advanced Yokeda, where you want to limit yourself to 3 global cooldowns on the back bar here, and you will have to do a little bit of a dynamic rotation because you might want to also use Flames of Oblivion just to make sure that it's up all the time. So that was one of the first spammables that we took a look at. The next spammable that we took a look at was none other than Flying Blade. Flying Blade damage was buffed a little bit here, so you can see the two comparisons here between Shrouded Dagger and Flying Blade. And Flying Blade doing about 1.1k additional DPS for the exact same stamina cost. So instead of using Noxious Breath, we'd be using Flying Blade instead. And so our bars will basically be looking like this. We basically replace Moulton Whip with Flying Blade, and on our back bar here, because we don't really need to maintain the Moulton Whip Seething Fury proc anymore, since we're not using Noxious Breath or Venomous Claws as our spammable now, we can just replace this again with the Fighter's Guild ability here, and I just use Rearming Trap here. That is the other spammable that was taken into consideration here. Now, the one thing that you will take note of is that Noxious Breath does cost less stamina. It costs about 33% less stamina than Flying Blade does. So your sustain with Noxious Breath is very similar to that with Venomous Claws, in that you're basically able to sustain a full light attack rotation, assuming you have good orb support and maybe Hercines in the group as well. So That is the downside of running Flying Blade here, that even though it does deal more damage compared to Noxious Breath in terms of damage per stamina use, not Flying Blade is going to be a little bit weaker here. If you are, the other side is though, Flying Blade does get a little bit of additional execute damage due to the Dual Wield passive here, Slaughter. So you do get a little bit more damage in execute range under 25% health if you have Flying Blade as your main spammable. But again, you are trading off some sustain in order to do so. Now, the final spammable that was taken into consideration was Rapid Strikes, which is one of the morphs of Flurry. So Flurry was buffed. I believe it got a 21% buff to its overall damage. So then naturally the question became, can we use Rapid Strikes with a VMA Daggers and pair that with something like Deadly Strike? So what your bars would look like is you would just replace Flying Blades with Rapid Strikes, and you would just be using Rapid Strike as your primary spammable here. Then of course you would have to end up changing out your equipment here, so you would end up wearing 5 Deadly Strike, 5 Reliquin, and then you would be using the Maelstrom Daggers as your front bar set here. So what I did here was I basically tested out all of these different combinations here. So I did this obviously all in the stamDK, so for mainly for the Noxious Breath spammable as well as the Flying Blade spammable, I used this build. So I used Veladreths, Reliquin, and I used Locustees as my front bar set. Weapons double sharpened, poison, and absorb stamina enchant. Maelstrom bow was infused with a weapon damage enchant. All jewelry was all bloodthirsty with all weapon damage enchants. All of my armor was medium armor with divines. I did have one max health enchant because they did end up nerfing Artem Takeaway Broth, so you won't have quite as much max health or max stamina anymore. So to make up for the health here, I did end up using a max health enchant here in order to bring my health back up. I had all my points into stamina here, and I was using the Shadow Abundance bars. I already showed you what my bars basically were. And then for champion points, your standard stamDK setup here. Oh, I had 75 into Arcanist. That's not correct. I should have 75 into Mooncalf, Nasty, 40 Shadow Ward, Tumbling, and Warlord. And our blue CPs, 48 Master at Arm, 52 Thaumaturge, 72 Precise Strikes, 34 Piercing, 64 Mighty. Recipes, 81 Ironclad, 66 Thick Skinned, 64 Hardy, and Elemental Defender. I do. I must have hit it the wrong button here. 81 Ironclad, 61 Thick Skin, 64 Hardy, and Elemental Defender. So that was pretty much the build here for using Noxious Breath and Flying Blades. And for our Maelstrom setup, we used Deadly Strikes. So we swapped out Veladreth for Deadly Strikes. So we had jewelry here. Exact same thing, bloodthirsty weapon damage, all medium, and I did have that 1 health enchant. Then Maelstrom Daggers, exact same traits, exact same enchants here. Now I did do all of my tests on the new raid dummy here, and that's because Locustees does require you to use synergies, plus it also gives us a kind of a good idea of what sustain would look like in a raid, because it does give you shards on cooldown, so it does give you a little bit of a better sense of where sustain would kind of stand in an actual raid environment. Parse itself is not necessarily going to be indicative of what you would perform in a raid, because it does give you 100% uptime at major force, which is obviously not realistic, but it does give you things like minor berserk. It does apply things like major fracture and alkosh to itself, so it is fairly indicative of, it's a good estimator to what you would potentially see in a raid environment. So here are all of our parses here. So I did 2 parses for each of the 3 different scenarios. So we have 6 parses in total here. So we're going to go over both the amount of DPS we pulled, plus I want to take a look at the sustain to kind of compare the sustain between all 3 situations here. So we'll just go through them each one by one. So this one here, I believe is, let's take a look here. I believe this is the Flying Blade parse. So we had 77.8k. 77.3k, just another Flying Blade parse here. For our Noxious Breath parse, we had 79.1k. Then the other one was 78k. This is our Noxious Breath. And this is our Rapid Strikes with the VMA Daggers, 76.7 and 75.6k. So you can see here that Noxious Breath is winning out here, 79.1 and 78k here, which is the highest. If we kind of zoom out here to see a bigger picture, Flying Blade is not too far behind, but our highest parts did come from Noxious Breath here with a 79.1k. And the VMA Daggers aren't doing terribly, but they clearly are not matching up to using Flying Blade or Venomous, not Venomous, Noxious Breath as our primary spammable. So now if we go ahead and take a look at our sustain, so let's hop over here. This is our DPS, so we're interested in our sustain, so we will take a look at our stamina percentage. Again, this is the Flying Blade Parse, so you can see here we do have quite large dips here. You can clearly see where we're using our standard to get our resources back. So right around here was when we were able to use our standard and pop it up, and then slowly bring it back down, and then we propped up our standard again, and so on and so forth. Now with the Flying Blade Parse, I found that I did need to use one heavy attack every other time I was on my front bar, so I would do my front bar rotation, back bar rotation, front bar rotation, do one heavy attack, and then go to back bar rotation and rinse, lather, repeat. So it was a fairly static rotation here. We see a similar thing here with the Flying Blade. This one was a little bit of a cleaner in terms of sustain overall. In terms of DPS, this was about the same here, so it didn't really impact me all too much. But you can see here, we do have some dips and spikes here. Now, if we take a look at the Noxious Breath parse, we can see that while we do still have, dips here, and you can clearly see where we're using our standard in order to get back our resources, you can see that we're not dipping quite nearly as low as using Flying Blade as a spamable. You can see we did end up dipping below 25% for a pretty, it's a noticeable margin of our parse here, compared to Noxious Breath, where we dropped over under 25% only for a little bit. And for the second parse, we actually didn't touch below 25% at all. You can still see where we're using our standard here and there. Finally, for our VMA, this is very similar to what you see in Flying Blade, where you have a lot of dips and troughs here. Again, this particular parse was me trying to get used to the rotation. The second parse was obviously a little bit cleaner when I was able to get the rotation down. Very similar to the Flying Blade parse, I did have to do one heavy attack every other time I was on my front bar in order to sustain the rotation itself. And again, you can see just from the DPS that getting used to the rotation didn't really change DPS all too much here. 57.6 compared to 76.7. In fact, the parse there where I was a little bit more comfortable, I ended up doing worse. So, what does this mean for spammable? It does seem like the DK spammable is going to be Noxious Breath. That is, of course, assuming that they do not change the damage from Noxious Breath. So if they decide to drop the damage down from Noxious Breath a little bit, then it does seem like Flying Blade is going to be the best spammable for stamDKs. So it remains to be seen whether or not they're going to kind of touch this again, whether they're going to rebalance it or not. This is only the first week of the PTS, so we do need to be a little bit careful of kind of taking these results and applying them as if it was live. We do need to wait and see what other sort of balance changes they decide to make in the PTS life cycle. That is it for this video. Hope you guys found this informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.